Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Phoebe Thorpe, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the We Were There series. This series was conceived so that the original CDC investigators can share their stories and lessons learned so that others may be inspired to continue their work. Again, thank you very much for joining us. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Schuchat, our Deputy Director, for a few words.
Thanks so much, Phoebe, and thanks everybody for joining us for our next installment of We Were There. Like perhaps half of you, I have some personal perspectives on today's topic. If you have handled a box of tampons in the last 35 years, you will have noticed a warning label about a potentially fatal disease, toxic shock syndrome. CDC and the nation's public health system were immersed in the science and saga of recognizing this life-threatening syndrome, figuring out how to study it, and uncovering ways to prevent it. When I was in college, the house I lived in received a free sampler package of tampons in the mail, part of a new mass marketing campaign for a high absorbency product called Rely, a campaign that would later become a business school case study because of its unfortunate ramifications. Nearly a decade later, as a new EIS officer, in the desk that I was assigned in the Special Pathogens branch, I found a box of Rely tampons. The box had the tagline, "It even absorbs the worry." When CDC was developing our museum, I passed the relic along. In addition to that box, my EIS assignment came with the opportunity to work on surveillance for toxic shock syndrome. This was long after all the excitement you'll hear about today, but I got to write an MMWR article on the first decade of toxic shock surveillance, which showed the major decline in incidents associated with key public health interventions. I wanted to work on other areas that could achieve that type of impact. Toxic shock syndrome and the initial public health response consumed my interest as I read the landmark articles describing the initial investigations and learned about the innovative approaches used to study this scary new disease in the face of enormous media interest and potential biases. I said you could learn all of epidemiology through studying toxic shock syndrome. I've subsequently told trainees the same thing about several other conditions. But toxic shock was my first, and your first is always special. CDC has dealt with other mysteries and scary conditions, but the race against time to tackle a disease that can rapidly kill or maim healthy young women had particular immediacy. Toxic shock syndrome established new ways of working, including setting legal precedents that resonate today. Our speakers made history, and today we all have a front row seat to learn from them.
Thank you, Dr. Schuchat. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, two of whom are shown here, Dr. Shands and Dr. Reingold. Standing over them is Dr. Bruce Stan, who you'll hear about today, but is no longer with us, and Mr. Gene Matthews, who will talk about the lasting legal implications of the toxic shock investigation.
As Art and Gene and I were preparing for this presentation, Gene commented that all of what we'll be describing today took place so long ago that almost nobody in this young audience would even know what toxic shock syndrome was. And as Anne alluded to, I said, well, that wasn't entirely true because approximately half of today's audience gets a monthly warning that looks like this. Among other things, today's presentation will tell the story behind that warning label. On Monday, January 28, 1980, Dr. Andy Dean, the state epidemiologist in Minnesota, called Dr. Larry Schoenberger at the Viral Diseases Division at CDC to report 9 cases of a disease that was occurring in young women in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Doctors Joan and Russell Chesney, hospital-based practitioners in Wisconsin, had seen 3 of the cases and had recognized that it looked like a disease first reported in Lancet in 1978 by Dr. James Todd, a pediatrician in Denver, Colorado. Dr. Todd's cases had occurred in 7 children, aged 8 to 17, who presented with high fever, headache, confusion, and a scarlatiniform rash followed by desquamation of the skin and peeling of the palms and soles during convalescence. Most of the patients also had other symptoms, including vomiting, watery diarrhea, and severe prolonged shock. 1 patient had died. The disease was similar to scarlet fever and Kawasaki disease, but the organism involved was Staphylococcus aureus, phage group 1, which had been isolated from various sites in 5 of the patients. And the staph organisms had produced an exotoxin. Dr. Todd named the disease toxic shock syndrome, or TSS for short. The following day, Dr. Schoenberger, this is Dr. Todd, as you can see on the left. The following day, Dr. Schoenberger passed the information along to the Bacterial Diseases Division because of the association with staphylococcal toxins. I was a first-year EIS officer in the Special Pathogens branch, and I was assigned to investigate. I talked to Dr. Dean and Dr. Jeff Davis on the right, the state epidemiologist in Wisconsin, and learned that all of the cases had occurred since November 29, 1979, and they were all in women between the ages of 14 and 44. An infectious disease specialist in private practice in Minnesota, Dr. Christian Schrock, had taken care of 3 of the patients in Minnesota, and he had noticed that all of the women he had seen had onset of disease during or shortly after their menstrual period. I reported those facts to my branch chief, Dr. David Fraser, and he asked if I wanted to assume responsibility for this disease at CDC. I said yes. Parenthetically, I went for a run that afternoon with my good friend, Bruce Dan, shown in that first slide, an EIS officer in hospital infections, who told me I was crazy to accept responsibility for a little-known disease that was associated with menstruation. I'll come back to Dr. Dan later. On January 28th, the same day that Dr. Dean called CDC, Dr. Schrock had sent a letter to the Journal of the American Medical Association and to many infectious disease specialists in the U.S. That letter helped alert doctors across the country to the occurrence of a new disease. On January 31st, Dr. Davis, who had begun interviewing patients in December as they were reported, sent a letter to 3,500 physicians in Wisconsin describing the features of TSS and its association with menses. That letter helped establish a statewide surveillance system in Wisconsin. Initially, the disease appeared to be regional, although the state epidemiologist in Utah had also reported that he was seeing a few cases. And in February, the Utah State Health Department also began active surveillance of toxic shock syndrome. At CDC, our first priority was to establish a case definition. On February 15th, I went to Denver to meet with Dr. Todd, and together we developed a case definition that was reviewed and revised over the next several months by Jeff Davis and other physicians familiar with the disease. The case definition required a fever of 102 degrees or greater, hypotension, a sunburn-like rash, and subsequent peeling of the skin, especially the palms and soles. It also required involvement of at least 3 organ systems listed here, and reasonable evidence of an absence of other etiologies. For those of you who haven't seen a case of toxic shock syndrome, the following slides show the rash and subsequent desquamation of the skin. At CDC, we passively received case reports of TSS-like illnesses and determined whether or not they met the case definition. From February 1st to May 23rd, 43 additional confirmed cases were reported to CDC. As these case reports increased in frequency, it became clear that this was not a regional outbreak, but a national one, although there continued to be higher numbers of cases reported in some states than in others. We published an MMWR article on May 23rd, reporting the cases we knew of and the association with Menses and Staph aureus, and announced that we were setting up a nationwide case control study. The media picked up an announcement of a new disease, and Dr. Bill Foege, the director of CDC, was asked to appear before the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research. Dr. Foege asked me to accompany him, and on June 6th, we went to Washington to testify on TSS. Senator Ted Kennedy, the committee chairman, ended the hearing by saying that we did not want to unduly alarm the public, but it was important that physicians and patients learn that this is a newly recognized disease. As a result of media attention from both the MMWR article and the subcommittee hearing, even more cases began to be reported. Between May 23rd and June 27th, more than 50 additional cases were reported to CDC. 96% of those cases occurred in women 12 to 52 years old during their menstrual periods. And we knew that Dr. Davis was beginning to see an association with tampon use. We could not say definitively at this point whether the increase in cases being reported was due to increasing recognition of the disease or to an actual epidemic, but all signs pointed to a real epidemic. In early June, Dr. John Bennett, director of the Bacterial Diseases Division, decided we should establish a TSS task force composed of one member from each of the branches in the Bacterial Diseases Division. I was to be the chief, and Bruce Dan. That would be the very same Dr. Dan who told me I was crazy to accept the assignment, asked to be the deputy chief. The other members of the task force were Drs. Debbie Blum and George Schmid. At the time, we knew very little about tampons. 2 of the task force members were men, and Debbie Blum and I had never used anything but Tampax brand tampons. We did know that Procter & Gamble, P&G for short, had recently introduced a new brand of tampons called Rely, that Rely was super absorbent, and that several other manufacturers had followed P&G's lead in developing more highly absorbent tampons. So to learn more, one afternoon, in one of our less sophisticated scientific investigations, the whole task force walked to the nearest drugstore and bought a sample of every brand of tampon in every available absorbency. We then went back to CDC and spent the rest of the day dipping them into beakers of water and measuring the resulting drop in volume to see how absorbent they were. These next slides are photos of the way most of the tampons on the market looked at that time and the way Rely looked. Most tampons were cotton tubes. Rely was literally a bag containing tiny bits of carboxymethylcellulose. On a more scientific front, we initiated what came to be known as the first CDC TSS study looking at tampon use. From June 13th to 19th, we administered telephone interviews to 52 of the women with toxic shock syndrome that had been reported to CDC, and 52 controls. In the interest of time, and because it seemed at the time like a good way to do our matching, we asked our cases to give us the name of their best friend, and we used those best friends as the controls. Because of the striking association with menses, in addition to asking routine questions about timing of the illness, age, marital status, and parity, we also asked more delicate questions about the frequency of sexual intercourse, contraceptive methods used, and the use of tampons or sanitary napkins, and specifically about brands used, absorbency, and the use of deodorized tampons. These interviews had to be handled, needless to say, with significant tact and sensitivity. I remember very well one interview with a 16-year-old girl. It went something like this. When did your last menstrual period begin? I don't know. Mom, when did my last menstrual period begin? May 21st. When did you become ill? I don't know. Mom, when did I get sick? May 25th. What kind of sanitary product did you use? I don't know. Mom! And so it went until I asked, have you ever had sexual intercourse? Wait a minute, she said, let me close the door. On June 27th, we published a second MMWR article reporting on our study and on similar studies being conducted in Wisconsin and Utah. In our study, no statistically significant differences were found for any variables except tampon use. In Wisconsin, there were statistically significant differences in the use of tampons and the use of contraceptives. And in the Utah study, no significant difference was found on any of the variables, but a trend toward tampon use was seen. In the CDC study, 52 of the 52 case women who had onset during menstruation used tampons, as opposed to 44 of the control women. The night before the MMWR was due to be released, I was going over the data one more time, and on a lark, I ran a significance test using 45 controls instead of 44. And I realized that if only one more control had used tampons, the difference would not have been significant. I worried all night that we were about to go public nationally with a study that implicated tampon use, and it was that close to being not statistically significant. I rushed to work early the next morning and shared my fears with Dave Fraser. He patted me on the back and said, "That's what statistics are for." As it turns out, the reason our study came so close to being not statistically significant was because in choosing best friend controls, we had overmatched. Most of the women, the teenagers especially, influenced by peer pressure, tended to use the same products as their best friends during menstruation. In fact, that study has been used in the EIS course to teach new EIS officers about the dangers of overmatching. Because the study showed an association with tampon use, we had notified the FDA and all tampon manufacturers of the results of the study. And on the day before the MMWR was published, we had the first of many meetings with those groups. One of the questions raised at those meetings was whether or not there should be a warning for tampons. And while our first study did not show an association with any particular brand of tampon, it looked to us like Rely was overrepresented in the sample, especially when compared to market share. And so we began to think about a second study looking at brand use. We also began to learn a lot more about Rely. Procter & Gamble had done a massive marketing campaign, sending 45 million samples of Rely, like these. It says, "A special gift for the lady of the house." There were 45 million samples, and they were sent to American women like Dr. Schuchat, but ironically not including me or Dr. Blum. And they ran countless ads like these. And you can see, it relies so different it'll probably change the way you think and feel about your period. And Rely, it even absorbs the worry. In July, we added a fifth member to the task force, the new EIS officer in special pathogens, Dr. Wally Schleck. That summer was very busy. We were receiving increased numbers of case reports, recording data on them, writing up the first study for publication, planning the second study, meeting with the FDA and tampon manufacturers, and working with laboratory personnel at CDC and elsewhere who were doing more sophisticated studies on tampon absorbency and Staph aureus and its toxins. Because the disease had attracted lots of media attention, The entire task force was also doing countless interviews with newspapers and magazines. We were at CDC from 7:30 or 8 in the morning until midnight or after, 5 days a week and sometimes on weekends. As an aside, that summer was also especially hot. CDC was air-conditioned during the day, but we were sweltering at night. One evening in early July, Bruce Dan wandered off. When he came back, he said he'd figured out a way to turn the air conditioning back on in Building 1 during non-business hours. That made our long hours much more tolerable. Later that fall, Dr. Foege wandered up to my office on the 5th floor of Building 1, something he almost never did, and grinning showed me 2 graphs. One had a fairly flat line with a bump in it, and the other looked like an epidemic curve, a similar line but with a big bulge. I thought at first it was some kind of representation of TSS cases, but it turned out it was the BTU usage reports for Building 1 for the summers of 1979 and 1980, and 1980 was the one with the big bulge. He asked me if I knew anything about that, and I told him he might talk to Dr. Dan. The second study was conducted from September 5th to 8th. It was limited to cases that had been reported to CDC in July and August so that there would be no problems with recall when we asked about brand use. It consisted of 50 patients and 150 controls. Again, friends of the patients, but not necessarily best friends. 100% of the cases used tampons, and only 83% of controls did so. In addition, 71% of cases and only 26% of controls used Rely tampons. Both of these results were statistically significant. We met with the FDA on Friday, September 12th, the Secretary of HHS, Dr. Julius Richmond, the following Monday, and all of the tampon manufacturers and the FDA on Tuesday the 16th to alert them to our findings. A preliminary report of the study appeared in the Department of Health and Human Services HHS News on Wednesday, and the MMWR article reporting the results of the second study came out that Friday, September 19th. At that point, 299 cases had been reported to CDC in 1980, and 25 deaths had occurred for a case fatality rate of 8.4%. The HHS News on Wednesday, September 17th, reported that P&G, quote, vigorously questions the validity of the CDC study, end quote. But on Monday, the 22nd, P&G voluntarily suspended the sale of Rely tampons. On Thursday, the 25th, P&G signed a consent order with the FDA officially stopping sales and agreeing to a media campaign to alert women to the dangers of using Rely tampons. In addition, the FDA, with input from us, began drafting that warning label that to this day appears in all boxes of tampons. Most manufacturers began carrying that warning by late that year, and by December 20th, 1982, FDA had made it a requirement. The second study and its aftermath created an even greater media frenzy than the first study. I was flying back and forth to New York and Washington to appear on the Today Show, Good Morning America, the McNeil-Lehrer Report, and Nightline, and there were multiple articles in every major newspaper and magazine, including People. Even magazines like Esquire were getting into the act. This is a laboratory photo of Staph aureus microorganisms under the microscope, and Esquire's view of Staph aureus. In the months following the removal of Rely from the market, the number of TSS cases dropped substantially. By January 1981, the number of cases reported monthly had dropped to about half of those reported in July and August 1980. But the disease did not disappear. Ironically, Rely was such a popular product that some of the women who became ill after Rely had been removed from the market reported to us that they had continued to use Rely. In fact, a few reported that they had run out to buy up all the existing supplies when they heard that sales were being discontinued. However, rely was not the only factor contributing to the illness. Cases continued to be reported that were associated with other tampon brands, as well as cases that were not associated with menstruation, including surgical and non-surgical cases associated with staph infections in both men and women. In the ensuing months, there was considerable controversy about how large a role rely had played, about the role of the levels of absorbency in other tampons, and about the roles played by specific toxins. I will turn it over to Dr. Reingold to elaborate on all of that.
Well, thank you. Before I get to my prepared remarks, two apologies. One for my voice, the fires in Napa and a lot of smoke and all of that. Second, as a professor, I don't usually read talks, but I think the organizers felt more comfortable, particularly for Jean and me, making sure they knew what we were going to say ahead of time. So I think they felt they could trust Kathy, but weren't so sure about the two of us. Oops. Okay. So, as Kathy described, the removal of Rely tampons from the market did not lead to the disappearance of TSS cases related to menstruation and not related to menstruation, and they continued to occur throughout the U.S., with reports of cases pouring in from Canada, Europe, and the rest of the globe. At CDC and at multiple state health departments, passive surveillance for TSS continued, supporting additional analytic studies of the risk factors for TSS during menstruation and descriptive studies of non-menstrual cases. At the same time, laboratory scientists here at CDC and in Minnesota, Wisconsin, New York, Massachusetts, and elsewhere were busy studying and describing the strains of Staph aureus recovered from both menstrual and non-menstrual cases. These laboratory studies were attempting to answer three main questions. Had there been a change in the strains of Staph aureus circulating and causing disease? Was that a factor in the emergence of TSS? What toxin or toxins produced by Staph aureus were associated with the development of TSS? And what environmental conditions, especially in the vagina, were associated with enhanced production of the responsible toxin or toxins? Additional epidemiologic studies were being planned to try and assess the extent to which changes in the numbers or rates of TSS being observed over time, i.e. the apparent increase in 1979-80 and the apparent decrease thereafter, were real or an artifact of changes in the diagnosis and reporting of cases through what were largely passive surveillance systems. Simultaneously, associations of bias and sloppy study design and implementation were being made by academic investigators, some of whom also had called into question studies associating Reye syndrome with aspirin, leading to the planning of an Institute of Medicine workshop in late 1981 to discuss what we reliably knew about TSS in general and its relationship with tampon use in particular. And all the while, we were dealing with a veritable deluge of press and public inquiries. 1981 was indeed a busy year. Before moving ahead with the unfolding story of the investigation of TSS, it's worth recounting a detour we took in and around that time. While considered unlikely, we always wondered whether an association between tampon use and menstrual TSS could be due to intrinsic contamination of tampons with Staph aureus. So when we received a call from tampon manufacturer A reporting that they were finding Staph aureus on their tampons as they came off the production line, we felt we had to pursue the lead. So a team of four of us, two epidemiologists, Bruce, Dan, and I, and two microbiologists, Don Mackle of the Mackle Award fame and Camille Rashid, immediately left for Conway, Arkansas to conduct microbiologic studies of the facility and its employees. I still have an extremely vivid mental image of Don Mackle. I don't know how many of you knew Don Mackle. Well, I can't see the bottom of this, but of Don Mackle in his laboratory coat and his mask and his gloves swabbing the prongs of a forklift. Meanwhile, Bruce and I obtained self-collected vaginal swabs and hand and nose swabs from employees of the manufacturing facility, along with information concerning recent infections and the like. We'd already outlined and drafted an MMWR article that would crack the TSS case wide open. Fortunately, we never published it, as we ultimately concluded the company's findings were all due to sloppy technique and mistakes in their quality control laboratory, and their tampons were not contaminated coming off the production line. On that trip, I too learned firsthand the extraordinary creativity that Bruce Dan showed in problem solving, as well as his somewhat blasé attitude towards rules, regulations, and laws. But I'm not sure the statute of limitations has been reached yet for his activities on that trip, so I'm going to not tell the details of that here. Passive or enhanced passive surveillance for TSS was being conducted by many states and by CDC during this time, with the intensity and completeness of case finding undoubtedly varying by state and over time, making it very difficult to interpret temporal trends and geographic patterns. As this graph shows, the number of menstrual cases being reported to CDC began to fall in September 1980 and continued to decline thereafter, while the monthly number of non-menstrual cases being reported did not change noticeably. At the same time, as shown in the next graph, the two states with the highest reported incidences of TSS in 1980, Utah and Minnesota, saw divergent temporal trends. As you can see on the left, the number of cases in Utah fell, while on the right, the number of monthly cases in Minnesota did not. Among the recommendations made by the August committee convened by the Institute of Medicine, chaired by Nobel Prize winner Fred Robbins, at the end of 1981, was a call for studies that could describe temporal trends in TSS that would be as free of bias and artifact as possible. While a number of studies looking at hospital discharge diagnoses were performed, those that relied on the use of ICD-9 codes for TSS were hampered by the fact that the code was not assigned until November 1980, and the fact that such studies typically could neither confirm that cases with that discharge diagnosis met established diagnostic criteria, nor identify cases not correctly diagnosed. Arguably, the best studies were those that didn't rely, if you'll pardon the use of the word, on providers having made the correct diagnosis of TSS. One such study was done by Jim Todd and colleagues in 2 counties in Colorado, and one was done by Diana Petiti and me in the Northern California Kaiser Permanente Medical Care Program. Both of these studies, which required a massive amount of work, started with a list of the hundreds and hundreds of discharge codes that might have been given erroneously to patients hospitalized with TSS. We then reviewed all of the records with one or more of those discharge diagnoses and then determined which patients met a standard TSS case definition, regardless of what the discharge diagnosis the patient was assigned. As shown in the next 2 slides, this is the first of the 2. Both studies showed that going back to the early 1970s, non-menstrual cases of TSS were occurring in males and females, and that their incidence did not change noticeably. So this is the Colorado study. Both studies also showed a clear rise in the incidence of menstrual TSS beginning in the late 1970s, that's the bottom part of this curve in Colorado, corresponding to the introduction of Rely and other high absorbency tampons into the marketplace. While the Colorado study had very few cases, it appeared that the number of menstrual TSS cases declined in 1981 and 1982 after peaking in 1980. And on the next slide, these are the data from the Kaiser study. And again, you can see along the bottom, the non-menstrual cases relatively stable. You can see the rise in the increase in menstrual cases in the dark line. And you can see various changes in availability of tampons. And I'll let you decide whether you think the incidence of TSS went down afterwards. But I will point out that while these are rates, these are based on very small numbers of cases per year. Despite reviewing over 6,000 medical records, we still ended up with a relatively small number of cases to put onto this graph. Meanwhile, again, following recommendations of the IOM committee, CDC conducted 2 additional studies of the relationship between menstrual TSS and tampon use. A study by Seth Berkley, now the executive director of Gavi, for those of you who recognize the name, and others here at CDC compared tampon use data from 285 tampon-associated menstrual TSS cases in 1983 and 84 with national survey data on age and year-matched women. As shown in this graph, regardless of chemical composition, the odds of TSS increased with increasing absorbency. So one of these lines shows tampons made of cotton and rayon, and the other tampons made of polyacrylate and rayon. But regardless of composition, with increasing absorbency, the odds of TSS increased. And in a case control study that I led here at CDC, which enrolled cases with onsets in 1986 and 1987, tampon use was associated with an increased odds of menstrual TSS, and the odds increased with increasing absorbency, despite the fact that all major brands and styles of tampons had substantially reduced the absorbency of their products by then. So the absorbencies shown here were measured using an FDA-approved in vitro Syngina test meant to mimic in vivo conditions. And so here you can see that all of these brands and styles between 1979 and 1986 had basically been halved with regard to their absorbency, their measured in vitro absorbency, but the association with absorbency was still present in 1986 and 1987. Of note, the six-state active surveillance program funded to support studies of TSS during this time period was, thanks to the wisdom of Claire Broom, our branch chief, also used to provide gold standard surveillance for Haemophilus influenza B, Group B streptococcal disease, and listeria, becoming the forerunner of CDC's Emerging Infections Program and its ABCs component. Interestingly, despite the fact that none of the case control studies identified infrequent changing of tampons as a risk factor for menstrual TSS, the FDA decided to include advice to change tampons regularly when it mandated its warning label and a package insert. While these studies were underway, there was a constant stream of criticism concerning possible biases and other methodologic concerns that may have led both the surveillance efforts and the analytic epidemiologic studies to produce misleading results. One particular group of academically based investigators, who were well funded by the tampon industry, published numerous articles and thought pieces suggesting that, like the Aspirin-Rise Syndrome Association, the tampon menstrual TSS associations were largely or entirely the result of various forms of selection and information bias, and in addition, uncontrolled confounding. As Jean will relate, the leader of this group served as an expert witness in the lawsuits demanding that CDC turn over the names and other personal identifying information for cases in the CDC risk factor studies of menstrual TSS, asserting that years after the fact, he could, upon re-interview of these women, determine the extent to which their earlier responses concerning tampon use were accurate and how much exposure misclassification and recall bias was present in those studies. I'll leave it to you to decide the credibility of that assertion. While we were busy fending off claims like that and responding to public inquiries like this, and I don't know if it's still the case, but in my day, EIS officers had to respond to all public inquiries, however cogent or not they were. This is just one example. Investigators and laboratories at CDC and academic institutions in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Massachusetts, among others, were busy as well. Pat Schlevert in Minnesota, Merlin Bergdahl in Wisconsin, and Mike Reeves at CDC were identifying and characterizing what became known as toxic shock syndrome toxin 1, TSST1, the newly identified staphylococcal toxin responsible for most cases of TSS, especially menstrual TSS. It has pyrogenic enterotoxin and other properties and was shown to be a very interesting superantigen. Studies by Peggy Hayes and others at CDC examined historical collections of Staph aureus strains dating to 1956 and showed that 15% of strains made this toxin, and the proportion had not changed over time. Jeff Parsonette at Harvard and others showed that approximately 9 to 10% of young women in the U.S. had Staph aureus vaginal colonization, of whom approximately 10%, or about 1% of all women, had a TSST1 producing strain in the vagina at any one time, and that over 80% of young women had antibody titers greater than 1 to 32 against TSST1 and potentially were protected against disease caused by that toxin. Bob Arco here at CDC developed a rabbit model of TSS, and numerous investigators showed that the critical factors influencing production of TSST1 by Staph aureus in vitro and in vivo included CO2 levels, oxygen levels, pH, and perhaps cations like calcium and magnesium. The idea that introduction of oxygen into the normally anaerobic environment of the vagina might be a critical factor in how tampons increase the risk of menstrual TSS gained substantial traction. And vindication of the epidemiologic study that Rely tampons posed a markedly elevated risk of menstrual TSS came when studies showed that Pluronic L92, a relatively non-toxic surfactant used only in the manufacturing of Rely tampons, caused TSST1 production by Staph aureus strains to skyrocket in vitro. Work was even begun on a TSST1 toxoid vaccine against TSS. Meanwhile, lawyers for Procter & Gamble and other tampon manufacturers and hundreds of plaintiffs around the country were involved in literally hundreds of lawsuits and billing like crazy. For that part of the story, I'll cede the floor to Jean.
Nothing like a good setup like that. Thank you, Art. So, yeah, it got a little crazy. And I sort of want to talk to you about the years after this. And I guess I sort of began with something Bill Foege taught us repeatedly. The blessing and the curse of epidemiology is that sometimes we know the first chapter in the story and then the last chapter without knowing the intervening chapters. And, you know, you get the impulse, you've got to do something, but this fine lab science and a lot of the policy development and implementation takes some time. But it was a very media-intense period, as Kathy talked about. So the other piece of this was an insight that the legendary CDC communications director, Don Barrett, reflected on all of this. He said, the TSS outbreak of 1980 was one of the first times that women going to their doctor's office knew as much about TSS as did their clinician. Okay, prior to 1980, it was the old school way of medical practice was that clinicians got the information from medical journals and going to training programs and so forth, and then explained it all to their patients. We moved in 80 to a really intense, the media intensity bumped up, just like it's bumped up another logarithm recently with social media and all of the world that you're now immersed in 24/7, 365. But it was clear then that because of the media attention to this, patients knew about as much about this going in as their doctor did. And so it changed the dynamics. It changed the power equation. Now, that then led to, I think, a change in CDC's media tonality. In that rather, then it seemed frantic. It's very calm looking back on it now. But that frenzied world, it was important to be quick and nimble and get the information out to the public. Because if you didn't, other external experts like Art refers to would simply make it up. Okay, it's going to be a story, and you live in this world 10 times over now. And it was also really important, as they demonstrated in doing their EPI, for the feds to be on the same page with the states and the locals so that all the health officials were communicating essentially a similar message, and you didn't get that divergence that then, calls the CDC is saying this and Wisconsin is saying that, and oh my God, the sky is falling. Now, there was another piece about the media that I wanted to mention, and that was, again, Don Barrett, who was really a forerunner in this, realized very intuitively that it was smart media communications to go on and push young EIS officers out to do the press on these outbreaks. There was a trade-off. You're going to get some rookie mistakes of young, rookies not quite understanding how to go about it, but processes begin to train EIS officers in dealing with media relations. But those stumbles were more than offset by the credibility and the transparency of having these young scientists speak. And it really worked well. So there you see them up there. And, Wally Schleck on the right with his mustache, except for him, the other four look like they're in junior high school, I think, okay? They were representing CDC on toxic shock syndrome. And it worked. I think it worked. It was an important lesson to remember. Now, in addition to dealing with the media, we ended up dealing with a lot of lawyers, and that was where I came in. I was chief legal officer at the time. And so we had this quandary because given Dr. Foege's parable about you don't know the middle chapters of the book yet, they were still being discovered, yet there were vested commercial interests that were getting impacted. People were suing Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble was needing to defend itself to get all people's evidence, get all the information. So Freedom of Information requests came in and discovery began. And experts were retained to find the flaws in the work that CDC was doing. No great surprise, okay? So the legal team that worked on this, I was operating under the supervision of Dick Reisberg, who was the lead lawyer for the Public Health Service in Washington, D.C. So I was assisted by Karen Kaunitz, who was spouse of Andy Kaunitz in your same EIS class of the time. And then when she departed, Verla Neslin, who served a very distinguished career here and with the CDC Foundation. Nancy Buck was the chief lawyer for the Food and Drug Division in Washington. So Kathy worked with her on how to deal with this issue of the recall of the tampons by Procter & Gamble and all of that. And then ably assisted in the litigation by Nina Hunt, who was Assistant U.S. Attorney with U.S. Attorney's Office, Northern District of Georgia. Nina, did you get here today? You here? Yes. You look marvelous, darling. You hadn't changed a bit, okay? Yeah. And so we were pretty well left to our own to deal with this trench warfare that went on for about 5 years, okay? So Procter & Gamble, as Art said, wanted the names and addresses of the women in the TSS cases in order to interview them and find out the errors that were made of horrible proportions in the CDC small studies that we did. And we responded by turning over 34,000 pages of everything we'd done with the names redacted. And then we offered to send Procter & Gamble any questions they would like the women to be asked, and we would give them back whatever responses came in. Well, that wasn't good enough for Procter & Gamble. And so they demanded and they subpoenaed for the records. They wanted the names and addresses of the women in the studies. And as you heard from Kathy's summary of that little interview with one 16-year-old young woman, that was not going to happen, okay? We weren't going to give on that. So CDC was subpoenaed, and we challenged the subpoena in federal U.S. District Court here in Northern District of Georgia. Now, the key strategy in hindsight that really helped us was at some point we just unilaterally, we didn't tell Procter & Gamble, we didn't tell the court, we didn't tell nobody. We sent a letter out because we had the names and addresses. It was only like 200 women, both the cases and the controls in the total 2 studies, and basically asked them that P&G wants to contact you. Would you like to talk to Procter & Gamble. And that's the closest I ever came to scientific excellence right up there. Okay? It wasn't an unbiased study, and it wasn't intended to be. Okay? 32 agreed to this disclosure. 119 said no, we don't want to talk to Procter & Gamble. 26 addresses were improper. The others we didn't hear from. Now, that told us what we needed to know. Now, we had not a lot to go on this. We had a problem that there was no case that had ever been litigated like this, where a company was wanting the names of women, of subjects in an emergency outbreak public health investigation. So there wasn't a lot that we could hang our hat on. And Procter & Gamble was coming in full guns. We're being sued. We've got the right to every person's evidence, and we want the evidence to defend ourselves. What's the problem? Rules of civil procedure, Your Honor. But we had that powerful common sense argument that these women had voluntarily given very private personal information, including their menstruation habits and their sexual history. And this was done voluntarily in a public health investigation. They didn't have to do that. And we also had the fact that we had Jean Matthews' epi study showing that they didn't want to be disclosed. That didn't hurt either. Now, before you go to the mat on litigation, you've got to decide, can you afford to lose? And this was the logic that we went through. We thought we probably could, because as this ground on, we were getting up into 1983, 84, 85 in the AIDS era. And in the middle of that AIDS crisis, we began to believe if we got a court opinion that ruled against us, we had a pretty good chance of going back to the U.S. Congress and make a compelling argument why this needed to be protected if you want us to be able to get valid information in order to protect you from disease outbreaks like AIDS that was going on. So we rolled the dice, and it took a while. And there's my iconic figure of Nina Hunt giving them hell in federal court, and she was great, okay? We had to litigate 4 times. The first case we won in 1982 in the Northern District. Procter & Gamble appealed it to the 11th Circuit Court, and it was vacated. The district court decision in our favor was vacated because the particular plaintiffs had settled down. So we had to start it all over again. It became known as the Farnsworth case. Again, we won in Northern District Court. And then we went to the 11th Circuit. And I remember very vividly sitting back there watching Nina mop the floor up with Procter & Gamble's lawyer in oral arguments. And Larry Elliman was trying to explain to the panel, old men, that, well, we just want to ask them questions and see if this is right. And, well, this is private information. Well, yeah, it's private information, but if they don't want to tell us, they don't have to. And one of the sitting judges sort of roused up and leaned forward and glared down and said, "Haven't the women already said they don't want to talk to you?" I was feeling a little better that day. I don't know if Nina was or not, okay? Bottom line, we won, and we won big. Decision came out in Fed Second in April of 1985, and it couldn't have been a sweeter worded decision to support exactly what we were doing. And then a year later, the grand old man of health law, William J. Curran from Harvard, published this piece in the New England Journal of Medicine where he explained the whole case. So it just came out of the blue. And he explained in very common sense language what occurred. And he concluded with this great sentence: in one important aspect, the CDC has achieved an important victory for all researchers. who ensure the confidentiality of personal identity in voluntary epidemiologic studies that are conducted in the interest of the public's health. Bravo. We couldn't have gotten it any better. So, and that was kind of a big deal, particularly in the AIDS years. So part of the legacy of this is we at CDC got institutional credibility at really a key moment. Okay, we had done this, we'd handled this pretty well, and now we had this court decision that stood for the proposition that those in a public health investigation have some reasonable expectations of privacy. And that helped us as we were fighting all the confidentiality issues in the AIDS wars that raged through the 1980s. And then there was a public health law implication as well. That case, Farnsworth v. Procter & Gamble, came back to us about, I don't know, it was like 1997, 1998. We were starting to, Rick Goodman was pushing us to do more on public health law. And so he got Verla Neslin and I to go with him to, Phil Brockman was held at the time, these epidemiology summer institutes at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And we went up there to teach public health law for 2 weeks. And we kind of scratched our head, well, this is good, but what are we going to teach? And we went back and pulled out this decision. And it's a nice textbook case of the legal underpinnings for public health investigations, the privacy interests, the commercial interest, et cetera. And that kind of led us on into the beginnings of the CDC public health law program and the current public health law renaissance that I'm still a part of, funded with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation with the Network for Public Health Law. And so one takeaway from this, before I really pull back to where we are with the legacy, it underscored this difficulty of decision making without 100% data. And when you're in one of these Bill Foege described situations, when you don't know the middle chapters, then public health is sort of caught with this triangle of, we have a duty to the public generally to protect the public. What are we going to do about, saying something about tampon usage or rely tampons, okay? Then we've got a duty to the individuals who are impacted by that, and what's the treatment, what's the cure, or they're wanting all their information. But we also have a responsibility to the commercial interests that they are treated fairly, and not just sort of this is a quiet kangaroo court in a black box of epidemiology. And so it's complex, and clearly the commercial interests have liability to consumers as well. They've got responsibilities. So this, description up on the board comes around very frequently. You get into this all the time, whether it is the finding the salmonella at the church supper or contamination of wells due to a chemical release or whatever, where you can know the starting chapter and ending chapter and you're still working on the middle. So file that away. So let me wrap this up and we can go to questions. Just talking about John Snow and the public health legacies, because see, Snow dealt with the same thing. He had cholera in London, mapped it, came up with a correlation to the Broad Street pump. Germ theory was still to be written 10 or 15 years later by Cook and Lister and so forth. Yet an intervention was needed. And so this is sort of stepping back to this room right now. This is part of the magic of what goes on in public health. and what goes on using this tool of epidemiology. Today, we've just told you a little small story of something happened in basically 1980 and 1981, where it was brilliant epidemiology, thorough lab science, and some pretty courageous policy development and intervention. But it's just one little story in a much bigger picture of what it is that you do, okay? Bill Foege also talks about the cultural and organizational DNA of public health, of organizations, etc. And so having these sessions like this, whether it is we were there for people to come back and talk about the good old days, or whether you're talking about a cutting edge thing taking place now, it's part of this long epic narrative of public health. This narrative goes from John Snow, Alex Langmuir, Bill Foege, Mary Guinan, Claire Broom, Steve Thacker, to you and to those of you watching. Okay? This thing goes on. And so you're traveling these roads, and it's just a very important wisdom of having these things today. Now, you might think that we're three old people coming back from the past talking to you today about something, but actually we're commissioned by Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie Inception. We're time travelers from the future that have come back here today to plant a seed in your heads that you will downstream do the right thing and our future will be a lot better. Does that make sense to you, Art? Yeah, he's old with me. Seriously, you are part of a long chain that goes on. And so let me close. There's a great poem. I inflict poems on all my students at the end of the class. And let me just close with one, which comes from another narrative epic and a legacy of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. And it comes a time early in the Ring trilogy where the old hobbit Bilbo has to give up his ring of power, leave it on the mantle, and go off to write his memoirs. And Gandalf the wizard stays there until the young nephew Frodo comes to pick up the ring of power and carry it on, and they have further epic journeys to take place. So this is to you. This comes from Tolkien, Book 1, and it's called The Road Goes Ever On. The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say. This is the road that you are on, okay? This is, you have chosen public health, or in some cases, public health chose me, I guess, But just in closing, on behalf of Kathy and Art and myself, we envy your journey and where you're going with this. And we would say, go enjoy the ride. We surely did. Thank you very much. Questions?
In your statistical analysis, I heard a lot of discussion of and questions about when you go to your doctor. I didn't hear any discussion about the role of federal community health centers which are used and have been used in the last 35 years by lower income women and as stable for some sort of medical care. I was on the board of a federal community health center 25 years ago, quite frankly, in Atlanta. Quite frankly, I did not hear any of this discussion. So you have a lot of young women, and I have young daughters. They call me an old mother. But you have a lot of young women who are still using these tampons, and it is fashionable. So I'm asking two questions. How can we address this issue for younger women who are women who are using these tampons now? And then what statistics can I find somewhere on people who were probably not in the study, but were using community health centers as their primary care doctors?
I was hoping that as a 2X chromosome person that happened. You know, I mean, obviously, as we alluded to quite early on, working with the FDA, labeling and the package insert was mandated to make sure that any users of these products at least had access to the information. I have to say, the young women I deal with today, they all look at me like, well, of course I know that. Now, that's not a representative sample of young women in the United States.
Can you speak a little louder, sir? Did you press
The young women I deal with routinely know about this disease. The young women I deal with routinely know about this disease, and they look at me like, well, of course I know that, because they've read their package insert or the label on the box. But they're not a representative sample of all young women, and perhaps they're groups who are not being reached with these messages. So maybe there's a need for better communication around this. You know, in terms of your point about the community health centers, I honestly don't have a good answer for that. This is a disease that I point to my students that while the vast majority of diseases occur much more frequently in the poor and in communities of color, this, at least at the time, was a disease that actually, at least the menstrual form, tended to be more common among more affluent women because there were enormous differences in who used the product. And at least in the 1980s, women of color and poorer women were less likely to be tampon users. I'm not saying there wasn't a need to communicate effectively with that population, but I don't really know how to address your question about the community health centers.
Well, oh, I got it. Can you hear me now? In 1980, the lines of communication in some states between state health departments or local health departments and community health centers were not always optimal. Hopefully a lot of that has been overcome, and clearly now, you know, with all the issues around Medicaid, there is clearly, regarding clinical care, there's a lot more communication, but it still needs to be done. Point's well taken.
Good afternoon. First of all, I wanted to thank the presenters and everyone who worked on the TSS investigation. In March 30th, 1981, my parents got a call from a small hospital in Ohio saying that if you want to see your daughter alive, you need to come to the hospital ASAP. I was rushed into the emergency room with 104-degree temperature with a blood pressure of 10/0. They thought I had overdosed on drugs. My boyfriend at the time brought me in, and they kept asking him, what kind of drugs is she on? He said, she doesn't use drugs. They didn't know what was going on with me. By the grace of God, you know, I survived it. The physicians in this hospital had no idea what was going on with me, and actually said a prayer, and 4 days later, after being in a coma, I came out of it. I did lose all my hair, all my skin peeled. The one picture that you showed, very classic, my hands, I just would peel off my skin. But I survived it. So one day I was at home, I wasn't 16 years old, but I was 20. I got a call from CDC investigator wanting to ask me questions. I had no idea. I really didn't know much about CDC. And I had no idea who this person was. And I wasn't saying mom so much in the sense that what happened, but mom, should I talk to this person? So I remember the interview very distinctly. I hope I gave good answers. I don't recall. And I also remember Procter & Gamble wanting to speak to me. I didn't want anything to do with those people. I was just happy to be alive. So I guess lesson learned, 6 years after that, I started working in public health. I'd like to say it was because of this experience. It really wasn't. But, but I'm thankful to be working here at CDC. And I just want to say that to everyone, the work that we do is critically important. You know, I'm alive today because of that work. And getting the messages out quickly, you know, with good, reliable information is so critical. Even when we don't, as you had said, we don't always know the middle chapters, it's important to get that information out there because it does save lives. Thank you.
We want our online audiences to know that you can post a question to Facebook Live. You can also email our email box at wewerethere@cdc.gov, and we'll try to post some of those questions. I would mention that we've had people from all over the world on this webcast and Facebook Live: Portugal, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Cameroon, Thailand, Guyana, the UK, Pakistan, West Africa, and of course all over the United States.
Yeah, thanks so much for extraordinary reminiscences and education. Sometimes in the midst of an investigation, when there's uncertainty, the intervention is very extreme, and sometimes, you know, we delay and don't go with an intervention. In this particular instance, you know, Procter & Gamble voluntarily withdrew the product, but there was this association with tampons. And I'm wondering if there was some point in the first year or so of the investigation where people considered recommending that women don't use tampons. The label, I mean, I was involved with the label later on about what could we say, what shouldn't we say, and that balance between the evidence base and the risk, you know, the absolute risk versus the preferences that people have. So I wonder, for those of you who were there, if there were considerations about what the public warnings should be while you were still gathering data.
Repeat the question.
Okay. So because she didn't have a microphone, she was asking about the use of tampons in general, and in the midst of this investigation, what consideration was given to warning people about the use of tampons in general, or perhaps putting some kind of barrier for women using tampons. We did consider that. We debated it many times, and we thought that the best course of action would be to get as much information out there as we could and let people make decisions for themselves. As you know, as I mentioned, sometimes people don't make such great decisions. I mean, when Rely was withdrawn from the market, some women went out and bought all the available Rely. But you know, we can't impose restrictions on people who want to make their own decisions. And that was the decision that we came to, that it was the best we could do was get information out there, and it was certainly out there. I mean, the media attention was intense, and I think you'd have to be in a closet not to have read something about toxic shock syndrome and tampons in that era. But we agonized over that.
You were saved a little, too, by the fact that the epi curve was falling down. So
Right.
It wasn't as intense. You know, Rely was taken off the market, and it could have been just, you know, artifact, but the cases started dropping. That changed at least some of the political public relations pressure.
And the other tampon manufacturers addressed the issue to some extent by changing the absorbency, because it was pretty clear that, Rely set the standard, and the other tampon manufacturers followed suit by increasing absorbency. And then when Rely came off the market, the other tampon manufacturers, recognizing that superabsorbency seemed to be playing some role, backed off on the level of absorbency. So all of that was happening and was all factored into our decisions. I'm not sure that we had the power to do more than that, but
I would just say that perhaps a little later than you're referring to, I think there was at least an enunciated message, not as clear as the other ones we talked about, that women should use the tampon, the least absorbent tampon consistent with their needs. And if they really wanted to, minimize their risk, that they should use napkins. So I think that message was out there. It certainly wasn't as well distributed as some of the other messages we've been talking about, and I have no doubt that it didn't reach all the intended audiences. But I think there was at least an attempt to tell women how they could minimize their risk.
What would you say today to the young women on social media, that everybody's on social media anymore, who believe that certain tampons and certain other alternative menstrual products like menstrual cups are not associated with the risk of toxic shock syndrome?
So the question is, what would we say to young women today who believe either that things like a menstrual cup are not associated with toxic shock syndrome, or that currently available tampons are not? So I would have to acknowledge that as an epidemiologist, I have to say we don't know whether they are or they are not, and it's fundamentally no additional studies have been done since the ones we showed you. So there aren't any additional case control studies with currently available brands and styles, and I can't tell you what the odds ratio is or how it's associated with increasing absorbency, and I certainly can't tell you about the menstrual cup and whether it's associated with an increased risk. So I think all we can really say is we think there is still an increased risk associated with tampon use in general, that it probably increases with increasing absorbency. As for menstrual cups, I have one up on my shelf in my office, but I don't use it very often.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up about labeling. I was wondering how you came upon the amount of time a person should or could be able to wear a tampon, or if that was sort of beyond what you were doing at CDC.
we did not come up with any recommendation about the amount of time. That was really an FDA decision, and I'm not sure what they based it on. We couldn't correlate the amount of time. I mean, first of all, it's a tough question to get people to answer. But secondly, we had no way of quantifying that. And we decided that we would be going way out on a limb to say anything about that, but the FDA wasn't as cautious as we were, and they made recommendations based on I don't know what.
And I alluded to this fact that fundamentally none of the case control studies really said that if more frequent changing would reduce your risk, even though that is the message that's in the label and in the package insert, because that's what FDA decided was the appropriate message. Certainly at the time there was this sense, well, this is all forgotten tampons. Tampons that had been in place for 24, 36, 48 hours, and the woman simply forgot it, and that's the problem. That was clearly not at the heart of TSS. And I think you could argue that more frequent changing by definition increases more oxygen. So it isn't clear to me that biologically you'd think it would reduce the risk, but we really don't have any basis for an evidence-based recommendation.
Yeah, this is, I guess people can't hear me, but it's Ann Shook it again. Just a comment, since I inherited the surveillance system later on and Nancy Messonnier after me, and we did a lot of back and forth with the FDA over label language. I think there were some ingoing assumptions that a high absorbency product might be kept in longer, but it turns out that the people change tampons around the same frequency regardless of the absorbency level. But that was probably where that original, time factor came in. There was never any science to bring it, to support it. But the other thing I think was kind of interesting about the FDA and the labeling was the initial era. what was a super and what was a regular and what was I forget, all the other levels, were not consistent brand to brand. And so when you all were doing those surveys and asking people what brand they used and what type of product within the product, what absorbency it was, one company's super absorbency was quite different than another's regular. And so the FDA did end up with a standardization effort to say you had to be this range to be called high absorbency. It also brought up how difficult the measurement was. You talked about that, Art, in terms of developing the Syngina method of measurement, because it was difficult to get consistent values as they tried to test for this. So it's like a fascinating history in terms of getting to products that were safer, that women would have good information to choose from.
So for those who didn't hear that completely, I think what Anne's referring to is the fact that certainly the early studies relied on the label absorbency, and there really was no consistency. What's a super, what's a regular, what's a super plus, et cetera, and that all came out of this era. I would just point out that the last study I showed, the last CDC study, those calculations were based on measured in vitro absorbency, not on the label of the package. So I tend to believe that study in terms of the association with absorbency, but I totally agree with you that before that it was pretty much chaotic in terms of how things were labeled. That's for sure.
I think we had one more question down one front and one in back. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. So it seems like during the time when you were doing the investigation, there was a huge amount of media interest and a huge amount of public interest. And Jean, you flashed up a photo of 5 very young EISers, maybe 4 out of 5, who look quite young. What was the secret sauce there? I would argue that communications continues to be sort of a critical element of all responses now, whether it be Zika or Ebola or the hurricanes that are running through. What was so effective about the strategy that you deployed at that time?
I was mystified. The question is, what was the secret sauce that caused one guy with a mustache and 4 people who were in junior high school to be able to communicate effectively? And I mean, I came to CDC the summer, the fall before that outbreak. So I was all watching. I came from a pack of lawyers in Washington, and this was a whole different species here I was watching. But I saw this repeatedly, and I was mentored by Don Barrett, who was the public affairs officer, and went to lunch with him a couple of times a week. And so I marveled at how year after year new epidemiologists would be thrown into the breach, and there was a little sorting out, but they could do it. And so part of the secret sauce, I'm not quite sure, but it was clearly, I think, from the public's mind, seeing these fresh faces who are immersed in the data, who know it, who are speaking without artifice or a lot of spin, speaking directly to the public. That works. I mean, part of the secret sauce was Donald A. Barrett and how he shaped the communications of this organization for decades. I think back during the SARS era. I was here when SARS occurred in 2003. And you saw again in a much more compressed, merciless news cycle, various countries would try to throw somebody up to be the spokesperson on SARS, okay? And one news cycle and boom, they're gone. That didn't get it. It was kind of a trial and error process until you got someone who could speak with credibility. Not enough research has been done, I think, on what it is in an emergency that the public resonates to, that shows transparency and credibility and authority. So it's a very good question. I don't have an answer, but she had it.
If I could just make one additional comment, one of the other legacies of this was Dr. Dan did go on to a career in media, on TV and on radio, and would come back, I think, each year and train EIS officers in how to deal with the media. So while all of us undoubtedly made mistakes, and I can think of one classic one that he made in dealing with the media, he certainly learned from that, and then I think taught what he had learned to several generations of EIS officers.
Yeah, I think, in this day and age now of all this controversy over fake news, one of the things that was really striking to me as a green epidemiologist speaking to the public was the quality of the interviewers.
Yeah.
And, appearing on different shows, you could really see, sometimes the message that got across was infinitely more effective because the questioners were effective. And, that was particularly true of the MacNeil-Lehrer report. They really did their homework, and they probably reached a smaller audience than the Today Show and Good Morning America, but the message was clear and effective.
She did them all, by the way. Today's show.
There's a woman back there who wants this.
So Kathy, I have another comment, and I'd like to confirm if this rumor is true or not. I have always heard, I was in respiratory and special pathogens in '82 when this was going on. I did not work on toxic shock. But I had heard that when you started your case control study and designed your questionnaire, when you first went to the IRB, they said, oh, these questions are way too personal. You cannot do interviews. You have to send mailed questionnaires to be able to collect your data. And certainly for us that work in fields where we're asking a lot of sensitive personal questions and there's a lot of debate of what is too invasive or not, if you guys really did fight and say, no, a mailed questionnaire would not give us the response we need, we have to do interviews, that certainly also made a contribution to public health, but I don't know if that's true or not.
We did fight. Did everybody hear the question? Okay. We did fight with the IRB quite extensively, and I don't know if we set the standard, but we certainly, I can remember many times coming back up from being down on the second floor and going, oh my God, do we really have to keep dealing with these people?
That's all we have time for the questions. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the individuals. I know we had a fabulous presentation from the speakers, but also the individuals who are present who worked on the study or worked on the investigation. If they could rise, it would be nice that we could acknowledge them, including Nina, please. And I would like to take a moment to acknowledge those who continue their work. And again, thank you very much to the speakers for a fascinating presentation. Thank you. And lastly, there is a lovely display downstairs in the library, and there'll be a follow-up podcast with MMWR with an interview with Dr. Shands, so look for that. And thank you.